German pilots in World War II had a 70% chance of dying before the war ended. But here's what nobody tells you about why they kept flying anyway. When you think about World War II fighter pilots, you probably picture dogfights in the sky, planes spinning and diving, and brave men fighting for their countries. But the reality of being a German pilot was completely different from what you see in movies. These guys faced challenges that would make most people quit on day one. And by the end of the war, the Luftwaffe went from being the most feared air force in the world to sending up teenagers with barely 10 hours of flight training. So what happened? How did things go so wrong so fast? The German Luftwaffe started the war with some of the best trained and most experienced pilots on the planet. These weren't just random guys who learned to fly planes. They had been training since the early 1930s, and many of them had already fought in the Spanish Civil War between 1936 and 1939. That war was basically a testing ground for German military equipment and tactics. Pilots like Werner Mulders and Adolf Galland came back from Spain as combat veterans before World War II even started. But here's the problem that would eventually destroy the Luftwaffe. The German training system was built on quality over quantity. They wanted every single pilot to be exceptional. Sounds good, right? Wrong. Because when those exceptional pilots started dying, there was no one ready to replace them. The training pipeline was too slow, too careful, and too focused on creating perfect pilots instead of creating enough pilots. Compare this to the British or Americans. The British Royal Air Force was pumping out new pilots constantly. Sure, they might not have been as skilled as German aces at first, but they had numbers. And the Americans, once they got into the war, they were training thousands and thousands of pilots. They had the resources, the fuel, the instructors, and the safe airspace back home to do it. Germany had none of that by the middle of the war. Let's talk about what life was actually like for a German fighter pilot. In the early years of the war, from 1939 to about 1941, being a Luftwaffe pilot was probably the best job you could have in the German military. You got respect, you got decent food, you got leave time, and honestly, your chances of survival were pretty good compared to the guys fighting on the ground. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, German pilots were flying over England every single day. But even though they lost that battle, their casualty rates weren't terrible yet. They had experienced pilots, good planes like the Messerschmitt Bf 109, and they were fighting a defensive enemy. The British were protecting their homeland, which meant German pilots who got shot down over England became prisoners of war instead of just bailing out and flying again the next day like the British pilots could. But then everything changed when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. Operation Barbarossa opened up a front that was absolutely massive. We're talking about a battle line that stretched for thousands of miles. And suddenly, German pilots weren't just fighting in one place anymore. They were spread thin across this enormous front, flying mission after mission after mission with barely any rest. The Eastern Front was brutal for pilots. The weather was extreme. In winter, planes wouldn't start because the oil froze. Engines failed constantly. Runways were just dirt fields that turned into mud in the spring and fall. And the Soviet pilots, at first they weren't very good. Their planes were outdated, their tactics were poor, and German aces were racking up insane numbers of kills. Guys like Erich Hartmann, who ended the war with 352 confirmed kills, spent most of their time fighting on the Eastern Front. But here's what people don't understand about those crazy kill numbers. German pilots didn't rotate home after a certain number of missions like American or British pilots did. If you were an American pilot, you'd fly a set number of missions, maybe 25 or 50, and then you'd get sent home. You'd become an instructor, train new pilots, and share your knowledge. This system meant experienced pilots survived and could pass on what they learned. German pilots. They flew until they died, got captured, or became so injured they couldn't fly anymore. There was no rotation system. If you were good at your job, congratulations, you got to keep doing the most dangerous job in the military until luck ran out. And luck always runs out eventually. This created a weird situation where German aces had these unbelievable kill counts, but the average German pilot was getting worse and worse. The experienced guys were like gods in the sky, absolutely dominating their enemies. But they were exhausted, burned out, and there were fewer of them every single day. Meanwhile, the new pilots showing up had less and less training because Germany was running out of fuel, planes, and time to train them properly. By 1943, the war had turned completely against Germany. The Luftwaffe was fighting on multiple fronts. They were still battling the Soviets in the east. They were fighting the British and Americans in the west. They were defending German cities from bombing raids. And they were supporting ground troops in North Africa and Italy. There just weren't enough pilots or planes to do all of this. And then the Americans started their daylight bombing campaign over Germany. This changed everything for German fighter pilots. Before this, most air combat happened at the front lines. Now the front line was literally above German cities. American B-17 and B-24 bombers were flying deep into Germany during the day, protected by hundreds of escort fighters. The British were bombing at night. German pilots had to fly multiple missions per day just trying to stop these raids. The thing about fighting bombers is that it's incredibly dangerous. These aren't nimble little fighters you're going up against. These are massive planes covered in guns. A B-17 had 1350 caliber machine guns pointing in every direction. And they flew in formation, which meant if you attacked one bomber, you were actually flying into the firing range of dozens of guns from multiple bombers all at once. German pilots developed tactics to deal with this. They'd attack from the front, head-on, because that's where bombers had the least firepower. But this meant flying directly at a formation of bombers at combined speeds of over 600 miles per hour, taking a shot in the split second you had before you had to break away, and hoping you didn't collide with anything. It took nerves of steel and incredible skill. Some pilots became specialists in bomber destruction. They'd load their planes with extra cannons and rockets, turning their fighters into flying artillery platforms. But this made their planes heavy and slow, which meant if American escort fighters showed up, they were sitting ducks. It was a no-win situation. The fuel situation got worse and worse as the war went on. By 1944, Germany was running critically low on aviation fuel. This meant less training for new pilots and fewer missions for everyone. When pilots did fly, they had to be conservative with their throttle, which is insane when you're in combat. Imagine being in a life-or-death dogfight and having to worry about your fuel gauge the whole time. Training times got shorter and shorter. In 1939, a German fighter pilot would train for over 200 hours before seeing combat. By 1944, some pilots were being sent to the front with less than 30 hours of flight time. 30 hours. That's barely enough time to learn how to take off and land properly, let alone fight enemy aces who had hundreds of hours of combat experience. Let me tell you about what it was like for these young pilots who got thrown into combat with almost no training. They'd show up at their squadron, usually somewhere in Germany or France by 1944, and they'd meet the veterans. These were guys who'd been flying since the start of the war, covered in medals with hundreds of missions under their belts. And these veterans knew exactly what was about to happen to the new guys. There was a term they used. They called new pilots baby food because they usually died within their first 5 missions. The life expectancy of a new German fighter pilot in late 1944 was measured in weeks, not months or years. Some of them didn't survive their first combat mission. The veterans would try to help when they could. They'd give advice, teach tactics that weren't in any manual and try to keep the new guys alive. But there were only so many veterans left, and they were exhausted. Flying multiple missions per day, dealing with constant stress, watching friends die, knowing the war was lost but having to keep fighting anyway. It broke a lot of them mentally, and the planes they were flying were getting worse too, except for a few advanced models. Germany was producing fighters as fast as they could, but quality control was slipping. Slave labor in factories meant sabotage was common, parts didn't fit right, engines were unreliable. Meanwhile, American P-51 Mustangs and British Spitfires were getting better and better. These Allied fighters had the range to escort bombers all the way to their targets and back. German pilots couldn't hide anymore. They had to fight constantly against an enemy that outnumbered them, was better supplied, and was flying planes that were just as good if not better than theirs. Then there was the jet fighter problem. Germany developed the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. This thing was fast, really fast, way faster than any Allied plane. It could dive through bomber formations, take shots, and zoom away before escort fighters could react. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it was devastating, but there were almost no experienced pilots left. Most Me-262 pilots were still learning how to fly the thing when they went into combat. Jets were completely different from propeller planes. They handled differently, they had different tactics, and they were complicated. Plus, they ate through fuel like crazy and had engines that broke down all the time. Germany didn't have the fuel or spare parts to keep them flying consistently. The Nazi leadership also made stupid decisions about how to use the Me-262. Hitler wanted it used as a bomber instead of a fighter, which delayed its deployment and wasted its potential. By the time it was being used properly as a fighter, it was too late to make any real difference in the war. The final months of the war were absolute chaos for German pilots. By early 1945, the Soviets were pushing from the east, the Americans and British from the west, and Germany was being squeezed from both sides. The Luftwaffe was basically finished as an effective fighting force. Fuel was so scarce that planes sat on the ground while enemy bombers flew overhead. When pilots did manage to get in the air, they were often flying against impossible odds. 10 German fighters against 100 Allied planes. 20 Germans against formations of bombers with 200 escort fighters. It was suicide, but they kept flying because what else could they do? Some pilots defected and flew to Allied territory to surrender. Others just stopped reporting for duty and went home. But many kept fighting until the very end, either because they believed in what they were doing, or because they were terrified of what would happen to them if they didn't, or simply because it was all they knew how to do. The last major operation for German fighters was defending against the final Allied bombing raids in April 1945. By this point, some units were so desperate for pilots that they were taking bomber pilots, transport pilots, even training instructors, and putting them in fighters. These guys had almost no chance of survival, and they knew it. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the Luftwaffe essentially ceased to exist. Thousands of planes were captured or destroyed. Surviving pilots became prisoners of war. The ones who'd fought on the Eastern Front and were captured by the Soviets had it the worst. Many of them spent years in Soviet prison camps. So what's the real story of German pilots in World War II? It's not a story of glory or honor or any of that nonsense. It's a story of how a well-trained, highly effective air force was completely destroyed by bad leadership, lack of resources, and a war that lasted way too long. The early German pilots were genuinely skilled. They had good training, good planes, and combat experience. But the system that created them was too slow to replace losses. And the way Germany used its pilots, flying them until they died instead of rotating them home to train others, meant that all that skill and experience was just wasted. By the end of the war, the Luftwaffe was sending up kids with barely any training in planes that barely worked, using fuel they didn't have, to fight an enemy that had already won. It was pointless, tragic, and exactly what happens when you start a war you can't finish. The survival rate tells you everything you need to know. 70% of German pilots who served in World War II died. Think about that. If you were a German fighter pilot at any point during the war, you had a 7 in 10 chance of not making it home. Those are terrible odds. And for the guys who served in the later years of the war, the odds were even worse. This wasn't about bravery or cowardice. Most of these pilots were just regular guys doing what they were told, fighting for their country, trying to stay alive. They were caught up in something way bigger than themselves, and most of them paid the ultimate price for it. If you want to see more videos about the real stories from World War II, hit subscribe.